everybody. Welcome back to the Starved Rock Murders. I am your host, Andy Hale. I wanted to give you all an update about where we're at. We had the evidentiary hearing this week. I'm recording this on Friday, May 16th. We had the evidentiary hearing Monday, May 12th, Tuesday, May 13th, Wednesday, May 14th. So thanks for tuning in. Special shout out to the Will County State's Attorney's Office. I know they're avid listeners to the podcast. Shout out to them. So let me give you an update. I'm going to do this without real commentary. I want to just keep it kind of factual since this is still pending. But I want to give you a factual update of what transpired and kind of what is next. So we started on Monday. Started with our first witness was Dr. Christopher Palahniuk from Microtrace. Microtrace were the ones that did the evidence inspection. When we were allowed to look at the evidence that remained, Dr. Palahniuk came there and basically cataloged everything that was available and took photographs of every single piece of evidence that was still impounded and maintained. His examination focused on the hair evidence that we ultimately submitted for DNA testing. So what Dr. Palahniuk testified to was the evidence that was shipped to Bodie for DNA testing. There was an envelope from 1960 handwritten on there that said hairs from the left glove finger, index finger of Francis Murphy. Inside that envelope was 2 glass slides with a hair in between with red tape on the end. So it was sealed and secure. The hair wasn't going to get loose. You could pass that slide around and there'd be no contamination. There were also 3 other slides that were in slide boxes, perfectly maintained, slides in glass slide boxes, all with the exhibit number 5 on them, which was the exhibit number given to the hair found on Mrs. Murphy's glove. And each of those slides had some hair fragments. All those slides were sent to Bodie Technology for further analysis. So Chris Palahniuk, Skip is his dad, talked about the evidence, the condition it was in, the labeling of the evidence, how a hair can't be contaminated. These hairs were in glass slides and mounted. Even if a hair was loose and you passed it around the room, what Dr. Palahniuk testified to is before any DNA analysis on a hair, the hair is washed, so the hair is clean. It removes any foreign substance or DNA from it, so it wouldn't be affected. But I thought it was pretty compelling evidence that he presented about the way the slides looked. He then passed the torch to Najee Bradley from Bodie. So basically, Dr. Palahniuk was present at the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office when those hairs, those slides, were sent to Bodie Technology for further assessment. So Najee Bradley testified about the hair contained in the 2 glass slides with the red tape on the end. She said she assesses those hairs for the growth phase, the color, the texture, the length, any root material. And what she noted about that hair was, as the growth phase, it was an anagen hair. And what she explained was anagen means actively growing. That hair was in the actively growing phase. There's 3 phases. There's 2 other phases. I'll probably forget the names. One means that the hair is in a transitional phase. The last category means the hair is basically like not growing, ready to fall out. This hair, the anagen hair, was in the actively growing phase. And what she said is those hairs typically only come out involuntarily. And that's important because our theory is the hair got on Mrs. Murphy's glove during a struggle from the person she was struggling with. So that hair is from somebody involved in the crime. She also said the hair had a root on it. She had wonderful photographs she brought with her displaying the root on the hair. And then she talked about how how there's follicular material around a root. So let's say you pulled out an eyebrow with the tweezers. You'll see like a little bulb maybe of the root, and then there'll be like a little white material around it. That's the follicular material, cell material. And she assesses hairs on a scale of 1 to 4, 4 being the most follicular material. This hair she categorized as 4+. So there was a lot of follicular material on it. She noted it was a brown hair, it was straight. So all that she testified to was consistent with the hair coming out involuntarily. Then we called Keely Coleman, who worked at Bodie at the time, who took that same hair. It went on for further analysis, and they did DNA testing on it. She explained the DNA process, how it works, how they conduct it, and she concluded that this was a DNA profile of a male, not Chester Weger, that hair. And then we called one more witness on Monday, Dr. David Fowler, forensic pathologist expert. And he first walked through by reading the autopsy, explaining just the devastating injuries these three women sustained. I think most people about the Starved Rock murders, when they hear the women were beaten to death, I don't think people really realize the extent of the brutality and the violence inflicted on all three of these women. I mean, all of them had their skulls fractured. He talked about how the skull serves a very important function. It's a helmet for our brain. It's very hard to break. It's an incredible helmet for our brain, and it takes a lot of force to fracture a skull. And Dr. Fowler said it would take a heavy object swung with force. And he noted from the autopsy the women had a couple distinctive type of injuries, some with a rounded edge, some with a pointed edge. And he said an object swung with force, a heavy object would be something like with a rounded edge like a baseball bat or a steel pipe, and a pointed edge would be something like a tire iron or a hammer. I mean, it would have to be a heavy object, he said, swung with great force. And he opined that the camera, the binoculars, at most could have caused some superficial injuries, maybe some cuts, some lacerations, but those little items were not going to cause skull fractures, these devastating injuries you saw. He even was skeptical that the log could have done all this. He noted there were crime lab notes saying the log was soft and spongy, high moisture content. He talked about reciprocal, I think he called it reciprocal velocity, or meaning the energy transmitted onto the ladies, that energy also gets applied to the object, the same amount of energy. So you'd expect there to be damage to the log, significant damage, which I didn't see any evidence of that. I didn't see any evidence presented at trial, at the criminal trial of that. And he gave an example of a case he worked on where somebody was struck just a couple times in the face with a wooden handle of a pickaxe, and how that wooden handle basically fractured in half from the force of those blows. So here he said these women had multiple, I think he said each woman had at least 8 to 10 unique, powerful strikes, and likely more. If you strike the same spot more than once, you can't tell how many blows the person had, but at least 8 to 10 unique strikes per person, and that something like the log wouldn't withstand that. And he talked about how Mrs. Oding had this O-ring fracture, and he said you commonly don't see that. You see it in things like motorcycle accidents where somebody gets ejected from a motorcycle, then their head hits the ground, and then their whole body, the force keeps moving forward. And he called it an O-ring fracture because her head was loose on her neck. And it was really powerful to hear him talk about the nature of these injuries. He also talked about Mrs. Murphy's missing fingertip. He thought it was odd that the word used was missing. The autopsy noted it was post-mortem. So he said that was something you can tell as a forensic pathologist because of the lack of blood. He said if, for instance, an animal would have chewed it off, it would have been very obvious. You'd have seen bite marks and teeth marks. There was no notation of that. He just noted that the fingertip was missing. There was no explanation for it. He also talked about how the head just bleeds profusely, and it would have been very bloody. And then when you strike something that's bloody, that creates more blood and more kind of blood splatter every time you strike something like that. And so he wrapped up, Dr. Fowler wrapped up our Monday. Those four witnesses are who we presented on Monday. It was our forensic day. Tuesday moved into some of our lay witnesses. We started off with Marcia Minot, who was the daughter of the telephone operator Lois Lensek. She's in her 70s now. I thought she gave some very heartfelt testimony about her mother, who was a telephone operator, took her job very seriously, was very dedicated, rose to be president of the union of the telephone operators. It gave a little background and context of, would this be the kind of person that accurately reported a conversation she overheard? So she gave some kind of background about her mother. Then we called Randy Reynolds. Randy Reynolds was the guy whose wife at the time had worked at the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office. And I think in 1982, he said, he went to a retirement party with his wife for Bill Dummett. Bill Dummett, as you recall, is the guy we've been claiming coursed the confession from Chester. And Mr. Reynolds said he was at one point in a small group of people. Bill Dummett was one of them. Somebody asked him about the Starved Rock murders, and he said, yeah, like in an arrogant way. He said in an arrogant kind of boastful way, yeah, I thought Chester was innocent, but I got him to confess. And he told that story very powerfully. I thought it was dramatic. I mean, I actually got a little choked up hearing that. I thought it was powerful. And he said he couldn't believe what he heard. He mentioned to his wife on the way home, like, what the hell was that all about? Why would he say that? It was short but powerful testimony. Then we called James Woods. James Woods was a man whose father later in life became good friends with Wayne Hess, who was Dummett's partner. And James Woods also gave very authentic, heartfelt testimony. Talked about how Wayne Hess, when he was retired, would ride around the milk truck with his dad and do the rounds, and these guys would kind of shoot the breeze. Talked about how one day Wayne Hess had a heart attack. His dad took the milk truck, rushed to the hospital, and Wayne Hess felt like he saved his life. But then the main part, James Woods said there was one time, and he was a young boy at the time, like 13 years old, but he distinctly remembers this because he had talked about the Starved Rock murders with his family. He was familiar with the Starved Rock murders from growing up in that area, having read the book. And his dad one day came home from work and told his mom, yeah, Wayne said what we did to that kid wasn't right, Really, it just wasn't right. And he felt bad and regret about it. And Mr. Woods explained in a heartfelt way his dad's reaction, his reaction. He just couldn't believe it, having heard it. I thought that was pretty emotional testimony, too. And then we wrapped up Tuesday with Roy Tyson, who gave lengthy testimony about how growing up he was good friends with Bobby Rona, got to meet the Rona family, met Bobby's dad, Smokey. And then as Roy got older into his 20s, Roy started working at various bars in the area and became closer friends with Smokey, who was much older, was kind of a bodyguard for Smokey, and told the story, and I'm summarizing very shortly, how one day he went over to Smokey's house and Smokey proceeded to tell him how he had been contacted by somebody from Chicago to essentially plan and organize the murders of these three women at the Starved Rock State Park. That some guys came down from Chicago Mafia guys, but Smokey was the local kind of guy, the local boots on the ground to organize how that was going to go down. And he recounted, I thought, pretty powerfully how everything Smokey had told him about how all that went, and told him the story, how the women were killed and guys from the Chicago Mafia came down to do it. And that was Tuesday. Okay, so one more day. Let's continue. Then on Wednesday, we started out and we called Colby, I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name, Lasyone is how you spell his last name, from Othram. Colby testified to how he took that hair from Bodie, got a DNA extract. He got a DNA extract from Bodie Technology from that same hair. They did a genetic sequence, built out a family tree, and were able to match that hair, that genetic sequence, to one of three brothers who were local to the Starved Rock area, Leo, Charles, and Edward Bray. He couldn't say which one it came from. That's as far as they could go in terms of their investigation, because two of the Brays, those brothers, didn't have kids, and we couldn't get any further DNA samples from people in the family. But what he did testify to was Othram was able to get a genetic sequence, build out a genetic database, and determine that that hair was from one of three local brothers, Leo, Charles, or Edward Bray. And then we also called on Wednesday Melissa Smith, who testified that when she was in high school, she was living with her grandfather in Norridge, Illinois. He had been a member of the Chicago Mafia. He was dying of lung cancer. And he told her how he had always felt bad that this guy in the Starved Rock murders was innocent. He knew that because one of the husbands wanted his wife killed, reached out to the Chicago Mafia to do it, and her grandfather handpicked the guys that went down there to carry out the murders. And she told that story. And I forgot, we also called, actually, as our first witness of the day, on Wednesday. We called an attorney named James McConnell. Melissa Smith later, when she was probably in her 20s, worked for James McConnell as a legal assistant. This would have been a couple decades ago. And James McConnell testified how, when Miss Smith worked for him, she started to recount to him how her grandfather told her this story about the Starved Rock murders. So it shows it's not something she came up with recently. It's something she had mentioned, a long time ago. And after that, and then there's a number of documents we introduced into evidence that were all part of the prior November 22nd, 2024 court order that some of you may have seen, where the court allowed us to present things like the Lois Zelensek telephone operator memo, where she recounted hearing two men talking about the murders and the kid had bloody overalls in the car and the other guy says to burn them. The interview of Glenn Palmatier, the polygraphs of the Palmatier brothers, the polygraph of the telephone operator, Lois Zelensek, how the polygraph operator claimed that Lois Zelensek failed the polygraph and the brothers passed, and the crime notes talking about some of the forensic findings. Chester Weger being interviewed by the Illinois State Police on March 18th. Nothing being noted about any scratches. I mean, we put in a whole host of documentary evidence. And after doing that, we rested our case. And then the state is free to call whatever witnesses it wants. The state is free to call whoever it wants. State called one witness to the stand. The state called Alice Rona Bohm, Smokey Rona's sister, who's still alive. And so the state called her to the stand as their own witness and asked her questions. She testified that Smokey at one point was dating one of Chester's older sisters. Smokey had met Chester. And then there's a little bit more came out on the direct. Not too much. Will County asked their questions, and then I got a chance to ask questions. So I brought out that Smokey had told her before he died that he had been involved in the murders. They'd been carried out by several other people. Chester Weger was not one of them. Chester Weger was innocent, and Chester Weger was framed. So we ended on that note. We ended with the state calling Alice Rona Bohm, who testified, my brother told me Chester was innocent and was framed. Pretty dramatic ending to the hearing. And that's how it went. And so now what's going to happen, and like I said, I'm just trying to tell this factually because everything is still pending, but I wanted to give you an update of how it went. That was the public record. My summaries, obviously there was a lot more testimony than that in terms of what witnesses said. But here's what happens next. The court gave us until May 23rd to submit written briefs in support of our respective positions. So on May 23rd, we'll be filing a very comprehensive brief summarizing the evidence that we presented this week, summarizing the criminal trial evidence from 1960, and making our case that the new evidence, when considered collectively with the criminal trial evidence, would likely have led to a different trial result. I will say this, it's going to be a lengthy, comprehensive brief. I'm going to post it on the podcast website once we file it. So if you'd like to read it, and I urge you to read it, it's going to be chock full of facts. Then what happens is we come back to court one more time on May 28th at 2 o'clock for oral arguments. So at that point, both sides will be able to present their arguments to the judge about what they believe the evidence showed, talk about the evidence, argue from the evidence, and make their final pitches to the judge, who then will likely take the case under advisement, hopefully not too long, and then we will ultimately get a ruling from the judge. So we are getting close to resolution, very close. Everybody out there, I appreciate your support and love. All the people that have reached out to me, but I wanted to give you an update of where things stand. Next thing's going to be the briefs that we filed May 23rd, oral argument May 28th. To be continued. Stay tuned for more. And on behalf of Chester, his family, myself, and my team, again, thank you for listening and thank you for your support.